Hello, good afternoon. I hope that you are all having a fabulous day. Thank you for coming back again to hear me talk about something that today I am maybe a little overly excited to talk to you about. If you watched the video from last week, I was talking about the role that evidence and advice can play in helping you identify and achieve your personal or your goals that you have for your family, health, nutrition, feeding goals. So again, the difference in the role that evidence and advice can play in helping you to identify and achieve your goals. Specifically, I talked about how evidence, in my opinion, evidence is really something we should look to help us identify what our goals are. And that advice is really more of a tool for helping us figure out how to achieve those goals. And that asking for advice without having a clear idea of where it is we want to go is ill-advised, because people are giving us advice based on their own path and their own destination. And so if we just follow advice without knowing where it's taking us, we might end up someplace that we don't want to be. Which of course leads to the question, how do I know what advice to use when determining and identifying a goal that I might have? What makes evidence, did I just say advice? How can I determine what evidence is good evidence to use in identifying a goal? And that is what I want to talk about today. I want to talk specifically about the hierarchy of evidence, specifically as it relates to study design. So when looking at research, and by evidence, I will probably use research and evidence interchangeably. When looking at evidence, there really are three areas that I think are important to look at. One is to evaluate and understand the type of study design that was used in producing the research or the outcome. The second, specifically with respect to nutrition research, is understanding the dietary intake methodology that is being used. There are a lot of different ways we try to understand what people eat, how they eat, and what they eat. And the type of dietary intake methodology that is used in these studies has some really important implications for the kinds of conclusions we can draw, as well as really just in terms of behavior. And so that is something very important, but separate from this video. And the third thing that's important to look at and to have a sense of and to kind of understand are specifically the statistical methods that are used when doing the research. All three of those, study design, dietary intake methodology, and statistical methods, are important in helping to really evaluate the quality of the evidence. But today I want to talk specifically about the hierarchy of evidence with respect to study design. So what do I mean by hierarchy of evidence? At the top, the best type of evidence, of research that you can turn to help you identify a possible nutrition goal, health goal, feeding goal for you or your family is a systematic review. Why? Because no individual study should, regardless of its study design, its dietary intake methodology, its statistical methods, no individual study should be interpreted in isolation. Systematic reviews aim to understand, identify, and summarize a large body of literature around a particular health-related issue. For example, there have been a number of systematic reviews conducted that look to understand the relationship between regular fruit and vegetable consumption and health outcomes, various types of health outcomes. A systematic review, rather than taking an individual study at an individual point in time in an individual population of people, and looking at that relationship. A systematic study takes multiple studies over long periods of time, and it applies very rigorous standards to identifying what studies get included and what studies don't. And it helps put every individual study, isolated study, in the broader context of this particular topic. And when systematic reviews or meta-analyses come out, we tend to be able to have a little bit more confidence in the results of those studies. Again, because they are based on such a large number of individual research studies. So top of the hierarchy, systematic reviews or meta-analyses. Next level, second, underneath systematic reviews, are experimental designs, and specifically randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials, RCTs, a randomized study. These are experimental designs where the researchers are specifically looking to understand and evaluate cause and effect. They want to understand the relationship between some kind of exposure and some kind of outcome, some kind of treatment and some kind of result. And they do this by taking groups of individuals and randomizing them to either receive the exposure, the treatment, the new drug, whatever it may be, and they follow them to understand the differences between those two groups in the development of the outcome of interest. So again, the reason that RCTs, randomized controlled trials, are so valuable as a study design is because it really helps us to understand cause and effect. But there are a lot of times when a randomized controlled trial may not be appropriate. And in particular, that is the case when if you know that the exposure that you want to randomize people to may not be ethical. What would be an example of this? If you suspect that there's a relationship between high levels of sugar intake or added sugar intake and the development of diabetes, it would be unethical for me to assign a random group of people to receive high levels of sugar or added sugar consumption, knowing that I suspect that they will develop diabetes. So in those cases, we need to move to the next tier, the third tier of study design, and that is an observational study. Observational studies are they are very useful. They are just not as valuable in helping us to truly evaluate cause and effect. They are great at examining the relationship between exposure and outcome when we are not trying to manipulate the exposure, right? We're not randomly assigning people to be exposed to something, when doing so would be unethical, or when the outcome is so rare that we would need to have a whole bunch of people randomized into these different groups in order to get a small effect or to have a small number of individuals develop that outcome of interest. So in that case, often what we turn to are observational studies, and it's easier for us to say, okay, here is this extremely rare condition. We have a group of people that have that outcome, condition, disease, and now we can start to ask some questions about what is different between the population of people that have that outcome or disease versus those who don't. And a lot of studies when it comes to nutritional studies are observational studies. They're easier to conduct. They're cheaper to conduct. In some cases, they are more ethical, right? Again, we don't want to assign people to a particular diet that we suspect will cause harm. So third on that level, that tier would be an observational study. There are lots of different types of observational studies, a cohort study, cross-sectional studies. These have their own challenges and limitations to understanding or evaluating or interpreting the outcome. A cross-sectional study, for example, is a form of observational study that that measures diet and health at a particular point in time, the same point in time, and it's very hard, impossible, to make causal statements about diet and health when you are measuring those two things at the same point in time. In order for something, an exposure, to cause an outcome, that exposure has to precede the outcome. And if you're not measuring them at different points in time, we can't make statements about cause and effect. So, to summarize, when we're looking at the hierarchy of evidence as it relates to study design, first and foremost, systematic reviews. They are at the top of the hierarchy because they help you take any single study out of isolation and put it into context of the larger body of literature. And you can feel more confident that findings from a systematic review are closer to truth. Second would be an experimental design or a randomized controlled trial. Now, these have their own limitations, of course, because sometimes RCTs are very small. They're conducted in a very small population or a very particular population. And so we are limited in the type of conclusions we can draw when we try to apply that to a different population or a different point in time. But they can give us very solid evidence of cause and effect. And the third type of study design then, and the lowest level of that hierarchy, would be observational studies, which are not as well suited to helping us understand cause and effect, but are useful for a number of reasons that I previously talked about, including the fact that they are oftentimes the only ethical solution. They can be done less expensively, more quickly, and they can help us to identify areas where we can then further test hypotheses about cause and effect or relationship between exposure and outcome using something like a randomized controlled trial. I feel like I just talked really fast, and I'm sure I missed some really key elements. And there is a lot more to be said about methodology for dietary intake, as well as statistical modeling and the ways in which we handle data statistically to try to draw conclusions and make relationships between exposure and outcome. But I am not going to go there today. So I want to leave you with this. What questions do you have about evidence or about headlines you've heard, and really understanding the relationship, the underlying scientific relationship between of those headlines? Let me know, and we'll see what we can find in the literature. Okay,